Welcome to Building Brainwaves. When I was a kid, I exhibited quite a few different signs of anxiety and OCD. And these signs usually came in the form of compulsions, which are the behaviors done to essentially eliminate or decrease feelings of anxiety. These were things like checking door locks multiple times, getting lost in thought, ruminating and worrying about anything and everything. One of my personal favorites here, I remember when I was a kid, I actually was afraid to swear, and I felt like I would actually go to hell if I did. I remember being super nervous about saying the wrong thing, especially in front of adults, because I was so worried about them thinking I was dumb, and so my compulsion was actually lack of speaking in a lot of those type of situations. Here's another good one. I remember walking down the sidewalk, and it made me uncomfortable if my number of steps per each sidewalk square were odd, so I felt like I always had to get 2. Now, I always knew that something was off about these behaviors, but I still justified them with labels and things I told myself, like, I just want to be safe. I'm just a really deep thinker. I just want to make sure I'm a good person. I'm just naturally shy. I'm just an even numbers type of guy, right? The scary thing about this is that every time I told myself something like this, I was basically just giving myself permission to indulge in those unhealthy behaviors more and more as time went on. And the justification actually became a compulsion in itself. Through the justification, I made them feel normal, and there were even some things that would have been perceived as normal to an outside perspective. Now, an interesting thing about all these behaviors that I was engaging in is that they could easily be separated into different themes or labels, which in the world of mental health is actually pretty common. Just looking back on the list of compulsions that I mentioned earlier, I could have easily been diagnosed with general OCD, pure OCD, which is essentially just thought-based OCD, religious OCD, social anxiety, and perfectionism. On the surface, these might all seem like very different issues, and unfortunately there are many professionals who would have diagnosed and treated them as very separate issues. But when we get a little deeper, it turns out that each of these different themes actually linked back to 2 very basic human fears that many of us experience. For me, what it came down to is that each compulsive behavior was a way to avoid the deep human fear of being alone and hated. I checked locks because I was afraid that if I didn't and something bad happened, I would be the one held responsible and that I would be hated as a result. I avoided swearing because I didn't want to be seen as a bad kid and disliked as a result. I didn't speak up around others because I was afraid I would say something dumb and that they wouldn't accept me. So again, though each of these thoughts seemed so different on the surface, and they could have been labeled as completely different, they were basically just different peaks of the same iceberg. And when it comes to recovering from poor mental health, we actually don't always need to label our experiences. Instead, recovery is all about taking our focus off of trying to solve our anxiety and these issues, and instead what we want to do is work on how we can make changes and direct our focus and behaviors toward the things we actually care about, regardless of how we feel in any given moment. So back to my experience with the different compulsions. Over time, my compulsions morphed and changed, but when I was younger, I never dug deep enough to actually discover and address the root fears that were associated with all these different compulsions. In fact, for the majority of my adolescence, most of these compulsions were mild, and I didn't give them a second thought. It wasn't until I was 19 when I had a full-blown meltdown that I realized that something needed to change. My meltdown came due to the fact that for years and years up until that point, I was slowly engaging more and more in unhealthy compulsive behaviors as a way to continually eliminate my anxiety. And the funny thing about compulsions is that they do sometimes eliminate anxiety in the short run, but in the long run, it always comes back in increasingly powerful and complicated ways. As the anxiety and compulsions built and built over time, eventually my brain just couldn't handle it anymore. I ended up having a panic attack, and it felt like my brain just completely blew a fuse. After the meltdown, I had a very consistent level of anxiety that felt completely immovable. And at this point, I had caught on a little bit on how to get myself better by cutting out compulsions, but I was still only getting rid of just surface level compulsions for things that were bothering me, and it got to the point where essentially another compulsion would almost always pop up to replace it once I got rid of one. So at this point, my condition ebbed and flowed between being tolerable to downright unbearable, but I still wasn't moving toward lasting change. I was still just addressing those surface level compulsions. In fact, it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I realized how all these childhood behaviors and everything after the fact, how they were all intertwined, and that I was able to actually get a handle on improving my mental health. It took taking a deep dive into the why behind my behaviors, learning to observe my brain patterns, and practicing redirecting my focus to the things that I truly wanted my life to be about. Once I found the real why behind my obsessions and compulsions, which was that deep-seated fear of being alone and being hated, I worked on accepting that deep fear and embracing the discomfort that that fear gave me. Ultimately, this concept of acceptance was one of the biggest components of working my way to a state of better mental health. So to sum everything up, first, there may be many different behaviors that you're engaging in that are contributing to poor mental health, and many of them may seem very innocent or even normal to you. The way to figure out whether or not your behavior is healthy is going to be by asking yourself simply, why am I doing this? And if the answer is that you're doing it to control, check on, or cope with a fear that you have, it is likely an unhealthy behavior. Second, labels can be dangerous. Justifying your behaviors with labels that might seem positive is something to watch out for. Also, be cautious about labeling your different types of struggles. More often than not, your mental struggles are going to actually be intertwined and related more than you might think. Third, ask yourself the question, why am I afraid of this, when you are confronted with a fear that you're doing compulsions for? And then ask it again and again and again. And as you keep asking why, you're actually going to get closer and closer to the root fear that is at the bottom of them. Next, once you find those deep root fears, work on accepting and embracing those fears and really work on cutting out compulsions that could be related to those in any way, shape, or form. Last, work on moving your focus away from trying to fix your anxiety and instead move your energy toward doing the things that you actually want your life to be about. Well, that's all I've got for this video. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you thought this was beneficial. Also, leave me a comment if you want to chat, and we'll catch you later. I still really like even numbers. I just don't let them control my steps.